Hi, I'm Victor Chalfant. I'm the Program Director of Graphic Design and Photography at Northwest Arkansas Community College. My dog Stanley and I are so excited to welcome you to the Ozark Media Arts Festival. I know that most of you are already using cameras and shooting photos, but some of you may still not understand exactly how to capture the scene that you see with your camera. So my goal is to help clear up some of the confusion that you may have about the controls on your camera. Everyone wants to take better photos, whether it's to record the beauty that we see around us, the amazing people in our lives, an adventure that we experienced, or even what we ate for dinner. Everyone has a story to tell, and we want to be able to share our experiences with others. So what do? First thing you do is you go out and you buy a nice expensive camera and start taking photos. But if you're using auto mode on your camera, you'll never be able to achieve the images that you imagine. So the first rule of Photo Club is always shoot in manual mode. Now that doesn't refer to the manual focus on your lens, but that is actually another way that you can push the quality of your images. Now photography is literally drawing with light, and it's fairly simple. There are only 3 controls that you have to learn on your camera. I'm talking about digital photography since most of you are probably working with digital cameras, but the settings are exactly the same when it comes to shooting with film cameras too, if any of you are interested in playing around with some old school technology. The settings that you need to learn are your ISO, your shutter speed, and aperture. Using a balance of these 3 controls, you'll be able to photograph anything. When you take photos in manual mode, you need to learn how to be sure that your photos are not too dark or too light. To get a proper exposure, you have to let a specific amount of light into your camera. A proper exposure fills the camera with that perfect amount of light. An underexposed photo is not letting enough light hit the camera's sensor, and an overexposed image is letting too much light hit the sensor. To control how much light is entering your camera, you adjust the camera's aperture. Having a small opening will only allow a small amount of light to enter the camera, while a wide aperture allows a lot of light to enter. Before the light can hit the sensor, it has to get past the shutter. The camera's shutter speed setting adjusts how long the shutter stays open and allows light to hit the sensor. The camera's sensor collects the light particles that enter the camera to produce the image. These 3 controls need to be balanced to achieve a proper exposure. Your ISO, or the sensor's sensitivity to light, the shutter speed, or the time, and the aperture, which is the amount of light that's coming into the camera. These 3 controls make up what's known as the exposure triangle. And it's the balance of these 3 controls that allow you to get the photograph that you want. To know if these 3 controls are in balance, you need to watch your camera's light meter. When the controls are all balanced, the light meter will be set in the center at 0. Learning where your light meter is on your camera and paying close attention to it as you take photos will be essential. Light meters are usually pretty easy to find on your camera, and they're activated by slightly pressing the shutter release button. When you look through your camera's viewfinder, you'll usually see the light meter clearly indicated at the bottom. If it doesn't appear, just tap the shutter release button to activate it. So now that you know the 3 controls and you found your light meter to be sure that they're balanced, let's get specific on each of these control settings. The ISO, or ISO, is the setting that controls the camera's sensor's sensitivity to light. Also, film is graded by ISO. And ISO stands for the International Standards of Operation, because this is something that is the same in every country. So the ISO is setting the amount of light that needs to enter the camera for a proper exposure. Or you can think of it as setting the size of the container that we need to fill with light. The higher the ISO, the less light is needed to get a good exposure. The lower the ISO, the more light is required. So the immediate question is, why not always use a high ISO? And the answer is that the ISO sets the quality of the image. A lower ISO is going to have better image quality, while a higher ISO is going to have more grain or noise in it. When you boost the ISO, it's like turning up the volume on a whisper. It makes the recording louder, but it also brings a lot of hissing and extra noise. And that's exactly what happens to your camera. And that's why the added grain is even called noise. The adjustment for your ISO is in a different location for each camera. Some even have a designated ISO button. If not, it should be fairly easy to find in the settings menu on your camera. If you're shooting indoors, there's usually less light available, and so you'll usually have to set your ISO a bit higher. With outdoor scenes, there's a lot more light available, and so you can usually set your ISO low so that you can get better image quality. Night photos usually require a higher ISO setting. But the general rule is that you keep your ISO as low as you can for higher quality images. This tends to be the setting that most photographers adjust only if they can't achieve a good exposure by adjusting the other two settings. So let's talk about the other two settings. The first and probably easiest to understand is the shutter speed. Remember that the camera's shutter speed is letting the light hit the sensor for a very specific amount of time. And by very specific, I mean it. Shutter speeds are usually measured in fractions of a second. But the shutter can be open for minutes or even hours in some situations. Freezing the motion of a hummingbird's wings is going to require a very fast shutter speed, like a 4,000th of a second. But recording these star trails requires the shutter to be open for hours. Any shot that has a shutter speed under about a 50th of a second will require you to use a tripod. Freezing motion like this can help to improve an athlete's form, or it can give a viewer the ability to see something that's never been seen with the naked eye. Freezing motion may be your goal, but sometimes photographers prefer to show motion in a photo through the use of a controlled blur. This shot was taken with a shutter speed of about a 60th of a second, and that was fast enough to freeze the motion of the people standing by the shops, but not fast enough to freeze the scooter as it quickly drove by. Creative use of the shutter speed can help to convey the story you want. Too much blur may confuse your viewer and not let them understand what's happening, but freezing the motion can make this look like a photo about balancing coins. As the photographer, you have to decide what works best for your particular story. You'll find the shutter speed dial usually somewhere near the shutter release button, that button that you press to take a photo. It's located near that to give you easy access to adjust while you're shooting. You'll see the shutter speed indicated on the camera's display or through your viewfinder. Remember that when motion is the most important factor in your photo, whether you're stopping it or showing a blur, your shutter speed is the most important part of the exposure triangle. Set your shutter speed based on the look that you want and adjust the aperture and or the ISO to balance that exposure. Achieving photos like this will be easy once you understand how to control your camera's shutter speed. The next control is the aperture. This is the one that frightens and confuses a lot of people, but I'll try to clear it up for you. The aperture is the opening in the front of the lens that allows light to enter your camera. If we have a large opening, the light can enter the camera very quickly, and with a smaller opening, it will take longer for the same amount of light to come in. Apertures are measured in f-stops. This is just a way to describe how opened or closed the aperture is. Small numbers mean a big opening, and larger numbers mean a small opening. That's part of the confusing part at first, but we'll clear it up in just a moment. In addition to controlling the amount of light that enters the camera, the aperture also controls what's referred to as the depth of field. Simply put, that's the amount of stuff in focus in the shot. This is a very important control because it can allow you to isolate your subject from its surroundings, which is great for portraits, or It gives you the ability to have the entire landscape in sharp focus. An easy way to think of this is that a smaller aperture number, or f-stop, means a smaller area in focus, and a larger one means a larger area in focus. The aperture adjustment on your camera is often controlled by holding the AV button and spinning that same shutter dial that you used before. But some cameras do have a separate dial altogether for aperture. You'll see the f-stop number on your display, but it doesn't always include an F before the number. So when the depth of field or area of focus is the most important factor in your image, the aperture is the most important setting in the exposure triangle. Set it to a high f-stop for greater depth of field, or for a low f-stop for a shallow depth of field, and then adjust your shutter speed and ISO to balance those two. When we think back to the balance of the exposure triangle, if we have a large aperture, like f2, the light will enter the camera quickly, so we can have a faster shutter speed, like a 500th of a second, and a lower ISO, like 200. So we could stop motion and or have less noise or grain in the photo. Remember too that this small aperture number is going to give us less area in focus. And this is an example of the type of shot that you could get with those sorts of settings on your camera. If we switch the aperture to a small opening like f16, it's going to require more time for that same amount of light to enter the camera. So we'll need to either have a slower shutter speed, or we'll need to increase the camera's sensitivity to light, or a combination of the two. If we set the ISO low for good quality photos, we'll need to adjust the aperture and shutter speed to balance the exposure. When we speed up the shutter speed, we're reducing the time that the sensor is exposed to incoming light, so we need to let more light in by opening up the aperture. And if we adjust one of the settings, another will need to be adjusted to compensate to achieve an equivalent exposure. If we set the ISO low for good quality photos, we'll need to adjust the aperture and shutter speed to balance that exposure. When we speed up the shutter speed, we're reducing the time that the sensor is exposed to incoming light, so we need to let more light in by opening up the aperture. And if we adjust one of the settings, another will need to be adjusted to compensate to achieve an equivalent exposure. Just remember to keep an eye on your light meter to ensure that you're balancing your settings. You can see that you always have to offset your settings. If you slow down your shutter speed, you're giving more time for the light to hit the sensor, so you need to cut down the amount of light coming into the camera. Or if you're closing your aperture down to increase your depth of field, you'll need to give extra time to allow light to enter the camera. So I'm sure that you've already noticed that the shutter speeds are doubling or cutting in half the amount of time with each full stop. Something you may not realize is that your apertures are doing the same thing. So from f2.8 to f2.0, it's doubling the amount of light entering the camera. And if you close down a full stop, you're cutting the amount of light in half. Realizing this can be a game changer for new photographers. So let's say that I'm trying to take a portrait of this child. The child's standing fairly still in front of me. I want to separate the child from the busy background, and I want to be sure that the image quality is really good so that I can make a big print of the photo when I'm done. So I set my ISO to my lowest setting, 100, to keep the image quality really strong. Then I set my aperture fairly low to give myself a shallow depth of field, f4.0, and I find where I need to set my shutter speed to achieve a balance in my exposure. Turns out that's 125th of a second. That seems fast enough to stop any motion in my scene. If the child and the chicken were moving too much, I would need to adjust my shutter speed to be fast enough to stop their motion. If I set it up to 250th of a second, that should be fast enough to stop the motion, but then I'd need to adjust my aperture to compensate. Since there's less time to let the light in, I need to let more light in, so I'd open my aperture to f2.8. If the child and the chicken were still moving, I would need to adjust my shutter speed again to be fast enough to stop that motion. If I set it up to a 500th of a second, I'd adjust my aperture to compensate, setting it to f2.0. If you find that you can't open your aperture anymore, or you can't move your shutter speed up more, the only other option is to go back and adjust the ISO, bringing it up a little higher. Just remember to keep your eye on your light meter to ensure that you're balancing your settings, and you'll be able to take your photos to a whole new level. I hope that this helps to clear up any confusion over camera controls, and I hope that you can see that it's fairly easy to improve the quality of your photos and get exactly the image that you envision. The best way for you to put this new knowledge to use is to go practice. So go out and take some amazing photos and enjoy the rest of the Ozark Media Arts Festival. Good luck.